I'm reading chapter 3 of Santa and Pete. Addison's sitting on the couch. She didn't want to read with him. It was a crisp Saturday morning in late November, 1959, when my mother tightened the belt of her white robe with a pink rosebuds, threw her coat over it, and then bundled me up too. Together we walked hand in hand along the row of brownstone stoops to the bus stop. Bus stop a half block down from our home. This boulevard before us was grand, boosting architect lush, with old-world crest, regal faces, and fancy garlands. Many of the men and women walking up and down the street wore hats and gloves and pants with crisp crease. Even my mother cut a sharp profile in her trench coat, crunched at the waist. I'm sure no one suspected the nightclothes or the worry underneath. I don't know what kind of Christmas we were going to have this year, Terence, she said. She looked down at me apologetically. Her face was smooth, honey brown oval. She looked a lot like her father, and I looked like her. What's the matter? I asked. Is Santa sick? It's not that. It's that we have to replace the roof. You worried about Santa landing on it? Not exactly, she said, letting the words fade. Money was always tight around our house, even when my father had a long-run gig at a jazz club in Greenwich Village. Basil's father had been out of work for a while. He and a lot of other folks were boycotting some of the white stores on 125th Street because they didn't want to hire blacks, which that wasn't nice and was pretty common in the 1950s. Even as a boy, I realized times are hard everywhere and scary too. As black people and white people argued and sometimes came to blows over how to share America. And we still do that, and it's not right. Let's just share. We're all the same. We all believe the same. Before more could be said, we arrived at the stop. I squinted through the sunshine up at St. Nicholas Avenue, looking for a two-tone green southbound bus that I hoped would never come. Moments later, I saw it, and then suddenly, faster than you can say, Flash Gordon! My grandfather had arrived. He stopped exactly before us, then opened the door by pushing out a lever like the punching right hook of Rock and Sock'em robot. He looked proud and official in his blue uniform, tiny waves of silver hair flowing between his cap and collar. There's my co-pilot, he said in his booming voice as I slowly climbed up the bus steps, unsure of what would come next. That's when my mother, who followed me up, kissed him in turn and kissed me, and then gave me a secret push forward so that I would kiss him too. Then she rushed back down the steps and turned quickly toward me. Be good, she said in that no-nonsense tone she used when I was to follow her instructions. To a T, I watched through the bus window as she ran back to our house. I felt abandoned. Grab a seat, son, my grandfather's voice rattled me as he singled with his chin toward a brown vinyl bench opposite his seat. A second later, we were off. I looked around the nearly empty bus as I felt for my pockets for the toys I stuffed into them, a yo-yo, a few Tiger Eye marbles, and a rubber band-bound deck of Yankee player cards. My Willie Mays card topped them all. Even though he played for the Giants, he was my hero. I tried to copy his cool basket catch, the way he scooped up the ball right at his waist like it was no sweat. I brought along many distractions as I could, since boredom almost always got me in trouble. How long, I wonder, would it be before I did something that riled my grandfather? My parents lasted about 20 minutes. I looked at my grandfather's thick eyebrows and high, hollow cheeks and gave it a half hour. How you been keeping, son? He stared at my newsboy cap until I took it off. Fine. Sure are getting big. I drank milk, I said. I laughed and popped a couple of fresh shelled peanuts into his mouth. Did I say He laughed and then popped a couple of fresh shelled peanuts into his mouth. Red paper skin and all. I didn't know it at the time, but he made it a policy to keep at least a couple of clusters in his jacket pockets at all times. You know, he said, as he tapped the pedal, giving the engine a dose of gas, St. Nicholas Avenue. This route we're traveling right now used to be an Indian trail. And used to be that if you craned your neck just right, you could look down this hill all the way to St. Nicholas Church in Lower Manhattan. That's where your first ancestors was baptized, my grandfather told me, as we chugged along in the light Saturday traffic. Let you in on another little known fact. He was having fun now. I study his large, well-manicured hands.
Guys.
As they commanded the steering wheel. Basil was probably threading his kite and testing the wind by now. About 300 years ago, my grandfather went on, Wall Street wasn't even a street. Just a wooden wall about 10 feet tall that stretched from the east to the west at the northern edge of the colony. Part of the reason they built it was to keep the Indians out. The Empire State Building and the Statue of Liberty, he glanced over at me, didn't exist. Then he proceeded to erase the city I had just begun to discover. As he put it in place, a dusty old town called New Amsterdam. Why do they want to keep the Indians out? I asked Molly, curious. That's a long story, Sonny, he said, but we'll get to it. As we continued along the route, I began to think my parents were right. My grandfather was pretty bad off. He talked on and on, pointing out people and places just outside his window. The only trouble was that they flat out weren't there, like windmills at Macy's department store, or a frozen lake of skaters where a narrow of court buildings clearly stood. When he spoke of people like my grandmother or ancestors from long ago, it was after they were still alive. Right then and there, I figured that I should listen a little more closely so I could warn somebody if I thought the old man was really about to snap. When he finally dropped me off at home late that afternoon, my ears buzzed. As he walked me up to the steps to the house, I scanned the sidewalk for Basil. But he had gone in already. The sky mixed purple oranges and the streetlights flickered on, which meant it was too late to play outside. My father opened the door with a big, broad grin, but I flew under his arm. "Good night, son," my grandfather yelled up to me as I reached to the tops of the stairs. "Night," I shouted back. "Come back tomorrow for chapter 4. Addison wants to say bye.
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 Bye.